You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 180 years of Lutheranism in Australia.
A mighty fortress, it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Knight Jake Sable, the Knight of the Fortress. This year is 180 years of Lutheranism in Australia. On January 23rd, 1838, the first Lutherans landed in Queensland at Moreton Bay, where they were missionaries. And over the period of time, different synods arose and some disintegrated. And they all ended up uniting together over time. However, since the 1960s, there's actually been a number of splits in Australia. See, most people think that in Australia there's only one Lutheran church, the Lutheran Church of Australia. However, there are actually many more Lutheran churches in Australia. And so, on today's episode, I want to give a quick, informative episode summarising the different synods in Australia. So, I've got a list here. I've actually written up a document. You can find it on my website, The Order of Knight George. If you go to my website, www.knightgeorge.info, and you look up the article tab and you go down to Jake, you can go down to the bottom or so of that page and you'll find Lutheran churches in Australia, 1966 to today. Here I will have a list of Lutheran churches that have existed to this very day. So this document contains a list of all the Lutheran church bodies in Australia today. I've broken them up into two groups: the English church bodies, which are actually the official Lutheran synods, and then I've got on the back, I've got the non-English groups. These are little small groups that aren't actually in and of themselves synods, but little branch congregations from overseas synods. Some of them which are in fellowship with the LCA and some of them are not. Now this list of non-English churches isn't super detailed, as it's really hard to find information on these bodies, not because they're in different languages, there's just not a lot of information out there. They don't really have a lot of websites and there's just not much written on them. So I've pieced together what I could find on them, and I've put the ones that, as far as I can tell, they're in fellowship with the LCA, and the ones that, as far as I can tell, are not in fellowship with the LCA. I may be wrong about both of those, but if anyone has more information on these congregations and are able to correct me, I welcome your corrections. Anyway, let's begin our episode with the oldest synod in Australia, and also the biggest, the Lutheran Church of Australia, also known as the LCA. The largest Lutheran church body in Australia is the Lutheran Church of Australia, which was formed in 1966, which was formed from the two former Lutheran church bodies, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. They united to become one large Lutheran synod. The LCA has churches all over Australia and some congregations in New Zealand. If I'm correct, I think it's about 8. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what the number is. The head of the LCA is the synodical bishop. The LCA is also divided into different districts, with each district having its own district bishop. The LCA districts, going from west to east, are the Western Australian District, the South Australian and Northern Territory District, the Victorian and Tasmanian District, the New South Wales District, the Queensland District, and also the New Zealand District, as it gets to be its own separate district. The New Zealand District is pretty small, and it's only really gets to be its own district because it's over in another country and it's so far away. If it was much closer to Australia, I'm pretty sure they'd just amalgamate it into one of the other districts. The LCA is an associate member of both the Lutheran World Federation and the International Lutheran Council. The LCA is also a member of the National Council of Churches in Australia, And the LCA has official altar pulpit fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Papua New Guinea, the Good News Lutheran Church of Papua New Guinea, and has a recognition of relationship with the Lutheran Church of Canada. I don't really understand how that's different to altar pulpit fellowship, but that's what they have. The LCA also has many missions to the Aboriginal Australians, and the LCA also has German, Finnish, Chinese, Indonesian, and different forms of African congregations in Australia, which are considered member congregations of the LCA. So these ones are actually official LCA congregations, but instead of being in English, the services are in the languages of the people groups that they look after, whether they be German, Chinese, Indonesian, or whatever group they're looking after. There may be some more groups out there, but as far as I can tell, that's the list I was able to find. German, Finnish, Chinese, Indonesian, and African. I'm not sure how many different branches of African they have. I know for a fact that there are Sudanese congregations in Australia. I'm not sure how many other nations of the African continent we look after in Australia. The LCA also has fellowship with the German, Latvian, Swedish, and Estonian congregations in Australia. These ones are not members of the LCA. These congregations are officially members of different synodical bodies overseas, but they are in fellowship with the LCA. Moving on to the second oldest Lutheran church body in Australia. The Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation, also known as the ELCR. The ELCR is the second oldest and at the moment is the third largest. It was formed in 1966, the same year as the LCA, from a collection of leftover Elka congregations who refused the LCA Union of 1966, mainly over the issue of the doctrine of open questions. There was other issues involved, but that was their main one. These members are basically what's left of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia. Their founding pastor was Frederick Kleinig. The ELCR is based mainly in Queensland today. They have congregations at Brisbane, Toowoomba, Churampa, Kingaroy and Woombye. The one at Churampa is technically called their Lowood congregation, but it's actually in the suburb of Churampa. The ELCR also has one congregation in Melbourne, Victoria, and they also have a few preaching places in South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania. The ELCR is also in fellowship with Pastor Stuart Wood and the independent Lutheran congregation known as the Bible Lutheran Church in Los Angeles, California. The next synod we want to look at is probably, it's not really the third oldest technically. The origins of it would make it the third oldest, but details are a little bit confusing. This group is known as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, or the ELSA. The ELSA was officially formed in 1989. However, they had been formed from the Faith Lutheran Parish in Queensland, which had split from the ELCR in 1971 over the practice of head coverings. They'd been started by Pastor Keith Hunter, whom the ELCR had called from the Lutheran Churches of the Reformation in the USA. The ELSA currently only has one congregation in Maryborough, Queensland, but it also has preaching places at Nanango, Bilolia, and also on the Gold Coast. Historically, the ELSA also used to have preaching places in South Australia and Victoria, and actually had an official congregation in Elizabeth of South Australia. But over the last 10 years or so, those congregations and preaching places in the south basically disintegrated. The ELSA is in fellowship with the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod in America. And because of this, the ELSA is actually a member of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference, which was started by the Wisconsin Synod. The next Lutheran body on our list is a very interesting one. It's the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, which is an American synod. See, our Redeemer Lutheran Church at Kalanga in Brisbane used to be a member of the ELSA. They are now currently just a member of the L's in the US. So technically they are just an outreach mission from the Americans. In 1999, Our Redeemer rescinded its membership from the ELSA and joined up with the L's in America. However, because the ELSA retains full altar pulpit fellowship with the ELSA in America, Our Redeemer Kalanga still has full altar pulpit fellowship with the ELSA in Australia, even though they are no longer a member of the ELSA. Also, Our Redeemer, as being a member of the ELSA, is in fellowship with the Wisconsin Synod and is a member of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference. The next synod, which would technically be the third oldest synod in Australia, is the Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Church, known as the OELC. It is a very small synod based solely in Queensland. It originally formed in 1973 when they split from the ELCR over disagreements of worldliness, the immodest dress of women, and the length of hair for men. The OELC was founded by Pastor Audley Grieger, who had joined the ELCR in 1971 after he left the Lutheran Church of Australia. Audley was originally working in the centre as a missionary for the LCA. Then he went and joined the ELCR, and after about 2 years of vicaring for them, he split from them and formed his own church, in which he became the pastor of it. The OELC meets mainly in house churches, and they have members at Maryborough, Caboolture, Brisbane, Toowoomba, and also on the Sunshine Coast. They don't actually have any official church buildings, and they just mainly meet in house churches. They also at this point in time don't have any pastors. The next group is the second largest Lutheran body in Australia, the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, also known as the AELC, which is based solely in Queensland at the present time. In the past, it did have congregations in South Australia and Victoria, but currently they only have congregations in Queensland. The AELC was formed in 1993. It was formed from pastors and congregations that had left the LCA between the period of 1990 and 1993. The AELC formed due to continued growth of liberal theology inside the LCA, and there was a number of different issues of disagreement between the two. Chief among these were the inerrancy of Scripture, the creation-evolution debate, the immortality of the soul, and the role of women in the church. There was other issues there, but they're the main ones. The founding pastors of the AELC were Pastor Clarence Preveno, Vernon Grieger, and Melvin Grieger, which are actually the two brothers of Audley Grieger. The AELC had previously served across Australia. However, as of the present time, they only have 7 congregations, located at Minden, Marburg, Lowood, Toowoomba, Albany, Oakey, and Greenwood. In 2015, the AELC declared altar pulpit fellowship with the United Lutheran Mission Association in the USA. The next group is not really a group in and of itself. These are the independents. These are a group of independent congregations in both Queensland, Victoria, and South Australia. However, they all act as if they're an informal synod. These congregations are all independent, but them and their pastors are all in fellowship with one another. And they work together in a sort of makeshift synod. They in and of themselves aren't officially a synod, but when I do this list, I like to clump them all together because otherwise I have to go through about 12 different little independent congregations, some only having about 6 members. So I'd rather clump them all together just because it makes it much easier to talk about them. These groups, known as the independents, all kind of formed in 2008. These independent congregations are based at Highsville, Marburg, Minden, Toowoomba and Greenwood in Queensland, and also in Duriupta and Harndorf in South Australia. They also have preaching places at Mildura and Doing in Victoria. The next group is a very small independent group, and when I say small I mean it's a single family. This is the Steadfast Evangelical Lutheran Church. Steadfast is based in Tanunda, South Australia. It's an independent congregation which split from the Peace Evangelical Lutheran Church in Nuriupta, which is one of the independents. They split in 2010 over the issue of closed communion. See, the independents, after breaking from the AELC, began to practice selective fellowship rather than having strict closed communion. Steadfast, while still wanting to promote lay consecration, and thus therefore not wanting to go back to the AELC, wanted to continue with their stricter practice of closed communion. So this small group, which again I say is basically a family, broke off and formed their own independent congregation, Steadfast Evangelical Lutheran Church. In 2012, Steadfast declared altar-pulpit fellowship with the Church of the Lutheran Confessions in the USA. So while they in Australia are basically only a small family, they are looked after by the church in America. The next group, and basically now we're getting into just a selection of independent groups at the moment. The next group is Living Water Fellowship in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. The Living Water congregation split from the Bethlehem Lutheran Church Wagga Wagga, which was an LCA congregation, in 2012. Over a number of disagreements concerning the nature and purpose of church, the essence and purpose of a pastor, and the nature and purpose of a congregation's external ministries. Living Water affirmed the practice of lay preaching and lay consecration and also allows women to perform both of these roles. Living Water Fellowship is also basically the first church to endorse women's ordination, although I'm pretty sure at the moment they still have a male pastor. They are a member congregation of the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ in the USA, which is actually an association of independent congregations. So again, they themselves are a single congregation in Australia, but they're looked after by a bigger group in America. The next group is the Redeemer Christian Fellowship. Now, Redeemer Christian Fellowship, the exact details of this congregation at the moment are a little bit hazy as they're in a process of change. Redeemer Christian Fellowship is an independent congregation started in Melbourne, Victoria in 2014 by Pastor Troy Harris. Pastor Troy Harris is an American pastor who moved to Australia and, being unable to find a synod that he agreed with, decided to start his own church plant. Most of his members are actually converts to Lutheranism, some of them even being converts from Islam to Christianity. I'm pretty sure at the moment Redeemer is still a member of the Independent Lutheran Diocese in America. However, they are in a process of change at the moment and things may be different in the future. I don't want to talk too much on that because I don't know all the details and they're not really open too much about all the details, but I think they are either looking at breaking fellowship with the Independent Lutheran Diocese or they already have broken fellowship. They've also established a few church plants around the place, and so they are looking at maybe starting their own synod. A lot of this is basically just hearsay, and only time will tell what's actually going to happen with them. The next one is a very interesting group. It's called the Growth Lutheran Network, also known as the GLN. Now the GLN is a network of Lutheran congregations located in Perth, which formed in 2015, after there was a removal of a pastor from the LCA. Disgruntled pastors and members of the LCA had begun discussions in 2014 over dissatisfaction of the direction of the LCA. Following the removal of the pastor Michael Parker from the LCA, the GLN was formed in early 2015, being joined by Pastor G. Boladis. The GLN also has trained their own pastor, Pastor Schnell. The GLN, as of today, only has a single congregation at Elkamos, Western Australia, which is an outer suburb in Perth. Very interesting congregation. They're actually rather conservative and they're a little bit contemporary, but they're actually more conservative than the LCA. Not probably not as conservative as groups like the AELC. The GLN is a pretty conservative group, promoting things like creation and rejecting things like women's ordination. And now the last English-speaking group in Australia is Living Grace Church Toowoomba. Living Grace first emerged in 2000 as a church plant of the LCA's Wilsonton Glencoe Lutheran Parish. In 2002, Living Grace became its own LCA congregation, and in 2008 the congregation suffered a split, with many of their members moving to the Emmanuel Lutheran congregation in Toowoomba. Living Grace is a Pentecostal Lutheran church and is connected with the Toronto Airport Church, and they promote both the Toronto Blessing and the New Apostolic Reformation. Living Grace and their pastor Edgar Mayer even started what was known as Lutheran Renewal, a Pentecostal organisation within Australia which seeks to spread the New Apostolic Reformation. After conflict arose in 2017, Living Grace decided to leave the LCA. Living Grace was given a peaceful dismissal from the LCA on August 27, 2017, which means that they can return anytime if they so choose. While Living Grace sought to retain their Lutheran teachings, they dropped the name Lutheran lest they appear unwelcoming to the surrounding Toowoomba community. Thus they only call themselves Living Grace Church Toowoomba, technically making them the youngest Lutheran group in Australia. However, I use the term Lutheran very loosely when referring to the Living Grace Church. Now we move on to the non-English congregations in Australia. First, we're going to look at those ones which, as far as I can tell, are in fellowship with the Lutheran Church of Australia. The first one is the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church abroad. Following World War II, Latvian refugees fled to Australia. Amongst them were Lutherans. The Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church abroad was originally a branch of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Latvia, but in 2016, the Lutheran Church abroad established itself as a separate church body. The Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church abroad currently has congregations in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. In Strathfield, New South Wales, the Latvian Lutheran Church and the Latvian Uniting Church are united into the single Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Uniting Church. These are also the most widespread international church inside Australia. The next biggest would be the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, which has a diaspora in Australia. This diaspora first arose in 1923, making it the oldest of these international groups, when the Martin Luther Lutheran Church in Sydney split from the Uniting Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. In 1934, Trinity Lutheran Church Melbourne would also leave the ULCA. Melbourne would establish a second congregation in 1960, St. John's Lutheran Church Melbourne. In 1972, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, in Australia, would declare fellowship with the LCA. They still have their one congregation in Sydney and their two congregations in Melbourne. The next is the Church of Sweden abroad, which is a branch of the Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church, and they currently have congregations in Sydney and Melbourne. Again, they are also in fellowship with the LCA. The next group is the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church Diocese abroad. The Estonian Church abroad first established an Estonian congregation in Sydney in 1943. In 2010, the Estonian Church abroad was renamed the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church Diocese abroad. They still have, they are a branch of the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church, and they currently only have their one congregation in Sydney. Now, there are two little groups in Australia which are non-English groups, but they're not in fellowship with the LCA, as far as I can tell. There's the Danish Seamen's Church and Church Abroad. In 2004, the Danish Church Abroad and the Danish Seamen's Church united to form the new group Danish Seamen's Church and Church Abroad. They are a branch of the Evangelical Church in Denmark, and they currently have 2 congregations in Sydney, 1 congregation in Melbourne, and 1 congregation in Brisbane. Again, as far as I can tell, they have no fellowship with the LCA. The next church is the Norwegian Church Abroad, which is a branch of the Church of Norway, which started in 2004. They currently only have 1 congregation in Sydney. And that brings an end to our episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Goodbye and God bless.